Imagine standing in a quiet field in Europe, where the grass now sways gently in the wind yet beneath your feet. Generations ago, soldiers once fought and fell. How did this peaceful land witness so much pain? And how did countries once torn by war find a way to live side by side? To understand that, we need to journey through the story of Europe's long and powerful history with war. European wars have often begun from deeply rooted causes that were not always visible on the surface. Religion played a strong role in shaping early conflicts, such as the long-standing tension between Catholics and Protestants during the Reformation, which led to wars like the 30 Years' War. These were not just spiritual disagreements, they were tied to control, governance, and influence over entire regions. Territorial disputes were another source of conflict, where kingdoms, empires, and later modern nation-states fought over land and borders. Whether it was a valley between mountains or access to a sea, dynastic ambitions added another layer, as royal families often married across nations, making succession disputes international problems. For example, a prince in one country might have a claim to a throne in another, and this claim could become a spark for war. Over time, ideological conflicts emerged too, especially during the 18th and 19th centuries, when the ideas of democracy, revolution, and nationalism started spreading. Monarchies feared the rise of republics, and revolutions in one country often inspired uprisings in another. The French Revolution, for instance, frightened the monarchs of Europe and led to coalition wars against France. These complex origins meant that wars were rarely about just one issue. They were often a mix of beliefs, borders, power, and fear. As a result, even small incidents could trigger massive wars, like how the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 led to World War I. Europe's geography, with many nations packed closely together, also made conflicts more likely to spread quickly. The complexity of these causes means that war in Europe has always been more than just armies and weapons. It has been about ideas, identities, and struggles that lived in people's hearts and histories. Throughout European history, certain powerful nations frequently found themselves in conflict with one another as they competed for dominance, resources, and influence. Countries like Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and the Habsburg-led Austria-Hungary Empire were central figures in the balance of power that shaped the continent. Each of these nations had their own ambitions and interests, and their paths often collided. Britain, with its powerful navy and global colonial ambitions, was frequently at odds with France, especially during the 18th and 19th centuries. Their rivalry played out in Europe and in distant colonies. France, under leaders like Napoleon, sought to dominate the continent, leading to a series of wars that involved nearly every major power. Germany, after its unification in 1871, rapidly rose as an industrial and military force, challenging the existing order and threatening its neighbors, which contributed heavily to the tensions leading to World War I. Russia, vast and powerful, often intervened in Central and Eastern Europe, particularly in the Balkans, where its support for Slavic nations brought it into conflict with Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Austria-Hungary itself struggled to hold together a multi-ethnic empire, and its actions in southeastern Europe fueled nationalist resentment. These powers formed shifting alliances to maintain or alter the status quo. Wars like the 7 Years' War, Napoleonic Wars, and the World Wars were all rooted in the competition among these dominant players. The balance of power theory drove diplomacy and war planning, as no single nation was allowed to grow too strong without facing opposition. Over time, the repeated collisions between these nations carved the borders, cultures, and political systems of Europe. The power struggles among them did not just shape Europe. They also projected their consequences across the globe through colonial empires. The First and Second World Wars were among the most devastating conflicts in human history, and both originated largely from tensions within Europe. World War I began in 1914 after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. But the deeper causes had been building for years. Rival alliances, arms races, nationalism, and imperial ambitions created a fragile environment where a single spark could ignite a massive conflict. Once war broke out, it drew in most of Europe's major powers, including Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. The war introduced trench warfare, chemical weapons, and mass industrial-scale fighting. It caused the deaths of over 16 million people and led to the collapse of empires such as the Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and German. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 ended the war but imposed heavy penalties on Germany, which led to widespread resentment and economic hardship there. These conditions created fertile ground for extremism and helped Adolf Hitler rise to power. By 1939, Europe was once again on the brink. Hitler's invasion of Poland triggered World War II, a conflict even more destructive than the first. This war saw the systematic extermination of millions in the Holocaust, large-scale bombings of cities, and the use of advanced weaponry, including nuclear bombs. Over 60 million people died globally, with Europe being one of the hardest-hit regions. Cities were reduced to rubble, economies were shattered, and millions were displaced. The aftermath of the war led to a divided Europe, with the Soviet Union dominating the East and the United States supporting the West. Setting the stage for the Cold War, these two world wars did not only devastate populations, they changed ideologies, borders, and global power dynamics in ways that continue to shape Europe and the world today. And international alliances. The rise of nationalism in Europe during the 19th and 20th centuries had a powerful impact on the outbreak and nature of wars. Nationalism is the belief that people who share a common language, culture, or history should govern themselves and have their own nation. In multi-ethnic empires, like Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, nationalism stirred unrest as different ethnic groups began demanding independence or greater autonomy. In the Balkans, Slavic nationalism led to a series of uprisings and conflicts, particularly as Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, and others sought to break free from imperial rule. This environment of nationalist fervor created tension between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, eventually leading to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 and the outbreak of World War I in Western Europe. Nationalism also played a role in shaping the ambitions of unified states, like Germany and Italy. Both countries emerged in the late 19th century through nationalist movements that sought to consolidate fragmented regions into powerful centralized nations. This success encouraged aggressive foreign policies and a desire to prove national strength through military power. In the 20th century, extreme forms of nationalism fueled fascist regimes in Germany, Italy, and Spain. These governments promoted the idea of national superiority and expansion, which directly contributed to the causes of World War II. Nazi ideology, for example, centered on German racial purity, territorial expansion, and revenge for perceived national humiliation. After World War II, nationalism did not disappear, changed form. In the later part of the century, it reappeared in independence movements in Eastern Europe and in the breakup of Yugoslavia. National identity, once used to unify, became a reason for conflict again as new nations emerged from old ones. The story of European war cannot be told without understanding how nationalism shaped both unity and division across the continent. Following centuries of nearly constant warfare, many European nations began seeking ways to prevent future conflicts and promote lasting peace. The devastation of two world wars made clear the need for cooperation over confrontation. After World War II, leaders from Western Europe came together with the belief that economic integration could bind countries so closely that war between them would become unthinkable. This idea led to the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, which brought together France, Germany, Italy, and others to share resources vital for warfare. Over time, this evolved into the European Economic Community and eventually the European Union. These institutions focused on creating a common market, shared laws, and open borders, encouraging collaboration rather than competition. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was also formed in 1949 as a military alliance among Western nations to provide collective security against external threats, particularly from the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This alliance ensured that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all, which acted as a strong deterrent to war. The presence of international courts, such as the European Court of Human Rights, also strengthened the idea that disputes should be resolved through dialogue and law, not violence. Peace in Europe was further reinforced by growing cultural exchange, student programs, and cross-border projects that helped rebuild trust between nations that had once been enemies. Despite different languages, histories, and interests, many countries found common ground through shared values and mutual benefit. These alliances and agreements were not perfect, and disagreements continued, but they created a new foundation for peace. By choosing cooperation, Europe began to replace centuries of bloodshed with negotiation and unity, showing that former rivals could work side by side for a more stable future. Even in the modern era, Europe has continued to experience conflicts that remind the world how deeply rooted its history of war truly is. The breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s led to some of the most violent episodes in post-World War II Europe. As the communist government collapsed and the federation dissolved, different ethnic and national groups within Yugoslavia such as Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, and Kosovars fought bitter wars over territory and independence. These wars were marked by ethnic cleansing, sieges of cities like Sarajevo, and atrocities that shocked the world. Peace was eventually restored, but the scars from these conflicts still affect the region politically and emotionally. In recent years, the return of large-scale warfare in Eastern Europe has brought further alarm. Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 shattered the sense of post-Cold War peace. This conflict, rooted in complex historical claims, fears of NATO expansion, and disputes over national identity, has brought widespread destruction and displacement. Ukrainian cities have been bombed, millions have fled, and the fighting has drawn in support and condemnation from countries across Europe and beyond. It has reignited old anxieties about borders, sovereignty, and the role of power in European politics. Alongside military conflict, cyber warfare, disinformation campaigns, and hybrid threats have also become part of Europe's modern security challenges. Although institutions like the European Union and NATO still work to maintain peace and stability, the persistence of conflict in Europe shows that peace cannot be taken for granted. Memory of past wars continues to influence current decisions, diplomacy, and defense strategies. The continent's efforts toward unity and cooperation coexist with the reality that old rivalries, unresolved histories, and emerging threats still have the potential to erupt into violence. So, when we look at the long and complicated history of war in Europe, we see more than battles, treaties, or the rise and fall of empires. We see human choices. Choices driven by fear, pride, pain, and hope. From ancient feuds and royal rivalries to modern struggles for freedom and identity. Each chapter tells us something about what it means to live together and what happens when we forget how. But just as war has shaped Europe's borders, peace has shaped its future. People who once fought learned to talk. Nations that once stood apart chose to unite. And even today, in moments of darkness, there are still voices that call for understanding, healing, and cooperation. The history of European wars is not just a story of destruction. It's also a reminder of resilience, the will to rebuild, and the power of learning from the past so we can protect what truly matters in the present.